everyone, this is Amanda Borschel-Dan.
And I'm Jessica Steinberg,
your host for Times Will Tell,
a weekly podcast from the Times of Israel. Hello, welcome to this week's Times Will Tell. I am here in my home podcast studio. I know you've always wanted to know what it looks like. It's really just a study in my house that's used for many different things. And I'm here today with Eyal Sherf. Eyal is a singer, actor, chazan, that's a cantor, and musical theater lecturer with an MA in musical theater from NYU. He is Israeli. He has performed off-Broadway in New York. He has also acted in Israeli TV series. And as I said, I am impressed by this because I'm a rabbi's kid. He has even worked as a chazan in the States and still does. He also has this very known passion for edutainment, combining performance and instruction with teaching, and really all about his passion, which is musical theater, history, and creation. He performs these lectures around Israel. Just had one a couple of weeks ago. At the end of the podcast, I will tell you where the next two upcoming ones, when and where they will be. So, Eyal, tell us how you got into this lecture circuit thing. How did this happen?
Well, I trained as an actor in England and then, like you said, in New York. And I realized pretty early on that the performance aspect of it was just as interesting to me as the creative process, the work that went into creating those shows, the historical background, the way the creators worked with one another, and then I decided to take my interest and the passion I have for those aspects with my passion for singing and the performance element, as well as the instruction and the teaching and the explaining of it, and to put it all together and create those. You know, we can call them lecture concerts, but they're actually shows. They're actually shows that involve some information, but they are shows. We like to view them as shows.
Wait, now, and I'm curious also, you know, musical theater, which it's sort of like cilantro. Either you love it or you hate it, right? I love it.
Right.
I have, as you know, in my study,
Yeah.
the Chagall poster of Fiddler.
Yeah,
Fiddler.
that inspired the name Fiddler on the Roof for
Right,
for
but
that
before
show.
we get to Fiddler,
Yeah,
I don't want to
yeah.
give anything away.
Yeah.
So how did this Israeli guy from Haifa, right? How did you get into musical theater, which is, I always think of such an American thing, really.
It started with a British experience, actually, my having gone to watch the Phantom of the Opera when I was 17 or so, and that was kind of a life-altering experience in terms of, you know, it's like it was that moment where you just say, this is what I want to do, this is what I have to do, this is mesmerizing. You know, granted, specifically with Phantom of the Opera, you know, looking at it now and with perspective, you know, some people like it, others do not. I see.
That's funny that you're saying that. That's
yeah.
funny.
Yeah, but the thing about
wait. How do you feel about Phantom of the Opera now?
It still moves me in part. Other times, you know, it's you know, bombastic, kind of, you know, grandiose. And I think I read something. Somebody said it's an example of how a show can be both amazing and bad both at the same time. I don't think it's bad, actually.
But that is a great description.
It came to Tel Aviv a couple of years ago, like the international company, and I was moved once again, and I rediscovered like some of the music and some of the musical passages that not many people know, and I said, this is really wonderful.
What was your first lecture, or what was your first lecture show?
So the first one was The Sound of Goose Steps, and The Sound of Goose Steps came out of my having written an article for Haaretz, because this is
we're allowed to mention that newspaper.
Else. Oh, you're allowed.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay.
I'm relieved. Yeah. So I had written an article about The Sound of Music at the occasion of its of the 60th anniversary of its original Broadway production.
Which was when?
It opened November 1959. So that was like 2 or 3 years ago, and what I was, and as I was doing research and I explored a new production, that I kind of realized, well, this is a show that deals with a Nazi threat. This is the first musical theater piece that deals with a Nazi threat.
Oh, the first. That's interesting.
Yeah. That was a way to kind of see if we can go into more of the depth of it and more of its darker tones again, because people perceive it as this very saccharine piece. What other shows deals with a Nazi threat? And then I thought about Cabaret, in which it's more like central, and then the Producers, in which you can say all hell breaks loose. And I thought, well, why don't we get all those three pieces together and create an evening that kind of
handles all three
compares,
of them.
That compares the Nazi representation.
I was going to say to you that speaking of saccharine, that I was reading, I don't know why I was reading this recently. Christopher Plummer always commented on how saccharine he felt The Sound of Music was, and sort of seemed embarrassed about his appearance in it as Captain Von Trapp. And as someone who, it might have been one of the first musicals I ever saw on TV, of course, at the time. And it's a little upsetting to read Christopher Plummer saying that he really felt embarrassed about his appearance in it. Any thoughts about it?
Yeah, he called it The Sound of Mucus, actually.
Yes. And
he said that working with Julie Andrews was like getting hit with a Hallmark card every day.
Oh my God!
Now, ironically enough, she was undergoing, some kind of a personal crisis then, but that's a different thing. It is. Again, we can see why people view The Sound of Music as this, saccharine piece, and a lot of children stuff going on and stuff like that. But and one interesting thing to say about the movie is that there's a moment there that kind of distorts history, and that is the moment where we see the Nazi invasion of Austria, and you see the streets are empty. It's like, and you wonder, where are the Austrians, hiding away at home, fearing what's going to happen, rather than what was the true. Now, a glimpse into what historically really happened we got from Theodor Bickel, who was actually the actor who played Captain Von Trapp on Broadway. And he was a child in Vienna, and he says how from their apartment window they saw Hitler and Goering in their limo entering the street where that family lived.
Really?
And everybody's windows were wide open, cheering and welcoming them, whereas the Bickel family obviously hid in fear, and eventually the Bickel family were able to escape, and they came to what was to then Eretz Israel, and Theodor Bickel became an actor with Hakamari, and then went to London and became. So it's kind of but it's always and it's an interesting story. It's an interesting thing that the first musical that deals with the Nazi threat doesn't actually have a Jewish character in it, but has a Jewish actor with that kind of life story, playing the head of a non-Jewish family hoping to escape from the Nazis.
That's nuts. Are there any particular period of musicals that you focus on, given that, as I'm learning, there are many periods of musicals?
There are indeed. I am particularly fond of the Golden Age. I'm a bit old-fashioned, so I'm told. Golden Age is generally beginning of 1940s into the 1960s, give or take. The Golden Age is actually when Rodgers and Hammerstein started, and they're considered the fathers of the modern musical. And I guess to an extent, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that any musical that is created owes something to Rodgers and Hammerstein, rather, be it knowingly or unknowingly.
Okay.
And so the Sound of Music, from which the song we just did came, was actually their last show together, and I. I am a bit old-fashioned, so I'm told. Golden Age is generally beginning of 1940s into the 1960s, give or take. The Golden Age is actually when Rodgers and Hammerstein started, and they're considered the fathers of the modern musical. And I guess to an extent, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that any musical that is created owes something to Rodgers and Hammerstein, rather, be it knowingly or unknowingly. And so the Sound of Music, from which the song we just did came, was actually their last show together, and I I was interested to see what came before, and I had known Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific.
What year remind me, was Sound of Music?
So Sound of Music was 1959.
Oh, it was 59. Okay.
And I think also I'm going to say parenthetically that the reason why the Sound of Music deals with the Nazi threat in such a, I guess you could say, reticently
okay.
is because it's a time when the United States is only beginning to come out of a long period of silence about the crimes of the Nazis. I mean, the Holocaust was not even considered the major tragedy of World War II, and Holocaust survivors were still largely quiet. No, so that kind of reflected the times, and this is what we really try to do in our shows, is to say, well, what was going on then? I mean, it's not like detached from what's happening. We would not have a Hamilton if we didn't have Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Yeah, what do you think Lin-Manuel Miranda was listening to growing up?
Yeah, I mean, his like musical tastes are varied as far as we know, but we know that he's a big classic musical theater fan. So the thing about Rodgers and Hammerstein is, you can say a lot of things about them, but they really, in their 5 major shows, Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, and The Sound of Music, they really brought into musical theater subjects that we can't say that they had never been dealt with before, but the fact that like 5 of their major shows like deal with those really interesting, heavyweight questions, but still done through this wonderful combination that they kept seeking to perfect, of song, dialogue, orchestral music, and in a way, in that way, they were the model for the shows that came thereafter.
It's making me think about it's making me think about West Side Story, which of course just had the remake from Steven Spielberg, which my family loved. And then of course there were so many pieces in the press about it, including one very, very interesting one in the New York Times, I think the weekend that it came out, where a group of art critics, some of Latino background, some Jewish, spoke about the making of West Side Story back with Leonard Bernstein, and the inherent racism that these Latino art critics were seeing in this piece, in this play, in this musical, and the fact that they felt that Steven Spielberg didn't need to remake this again because it was problematic back then, and it's even problematic now. I know this is not necessarily part of your lecture when you talk about it, but I'm just curious, Eyal, how, in other words, on one hand, we're seeing this more rosy side of looking at racism, in other words, and recognizing it.
Well, first of all, it's interesting that you say that it made you think of West Side Story, because we know that Leonard Bernstein really appreciated South Pacific. So we think that in a way inspired him in that way to create a show about the horrific consequences of a rivalry between two groups. And I think it might be difficult for me a little bit as a white person to talk about the question you raise. And I think, let's just say that nowadays we can assume that a piece about a certain minority group would probably not be produced if it were not created by someone from within that group.
Yes.
Then
I think fair to say.
Yeah. So I think if we look at the creative process, though, I think what would be interesting to say is that initially West Side Story had been conceived as a show about rivalry between Jews and Catholics. and that was Jerome Robbins' initial idea. His last name, by the way, was Rabinowitz, but that was his initial idea, and he brought this idea to the playwright Arthur Lawrence, and Arthur Lawrence said, "I don't think so. It reminds me of it reminded him of a popular play that had been done before, and it's been done before, and let's leave it." And
we don't need to go there again.
Years pass, and then Leonard Bernstein and Arthur Lawrence meet at a California hotel, and then they read about gangs,
like on the streets of New York kind of thing.
I think they were reading about
L.A.
LA, and then the penny dropped, and then they said, instead of rivalry between Catholics and Jews, how about white people in New York, because that was the area that Arthur Lawrence knew best.
Sure. And Puerto Ricans.
Yes, and Puerto Ricans, and actually the Latino thing of it was a major turn on for them, because first of all, Leonard Bernstein was married to a Chilean. His wife was Chilean. He was fascinated by the fact that he would create this show that has those Latino style rhythms, and I think Jerome Robbins was then really turned on. So I think they wanted, as far as they were concerned, they may have been honoring Latino, music and culture, but I can't really say. I mean, Stephen Sondheim, the lyricist who recently passed away, did confess that he had never met a Puerto Rican person.
Oh, I read that somewhere, right?
So it's a complicated question. Many of the musical theater creators, first of all, 90-something% of them are Jewish. And I think it's it never ceases to amaze me, this phenomenon that the soundtrack of an entire nation was created by a group of Russian immigrants or their descendants. I mean,
right.
And, who very often drew upon what they heard in the shtetl or the synagogue, the most famous example being Baruch et Adonai Mevorach, it ain't necessarily so. Gershwin was inspired by the call to the Torah. Which
of course leads us to the poster that you remarked upon when you entered my study, which is as I mentioned before, the green-faced fiddler from the Chagall portrait, which you brought up that amazing anecdote of how they came about with the name for Fiddler.
Yeah, so first of all, it's an amazing story about a show for which they could not raise money. And those were a group of people, the composer, lyricist, Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick, respectively, who had already won a Pulitzer Prize. So they were working on this show.
They weren't newbies.
No, they were working on this show with a book writer, I mean, the person who writes the dialogues, Joseph Stein. And all three of them were working together. And Joseph Stein was saying, I could not imagine going to a producer and saying, well, here's a show about Jews in Russia. The first act ends with a pogrom. The second act or the show ends with them being evicted. They get kicked out of their shtetl, and then, well, go and produce this, Mr. Producer. And Joe Stein says wherever they went, the answer was no. And what are we going to do? Well, it's very nice, but what are we going to do when we run out of Hadassah benefits? So, and eventually, they did find a producer who was willing to take this on. It was Hal Prince, the great Hal Prince, who's just one of the major figures of musical theater in the 20th century. And then they went to Jerome Robbins, whose last name, as I said, Jerome Rabinowitz, just like Sholem Aleichem, who wrote the stories that inspired. Right,
that inspire the play.
So,
right.
But we talk about Fiddler as this wonderful example of how a group of people come to, first of all, of how a director does his job, because here's Joe Stein and Sheldon Harnick and they work together, trying to kind of working, and then Jerome Robbins comes into the picture and says, well, what is this show about? And they say, well, what do you mean? It's about this farmer and his daughter. No, what is the show about? What is the show? And then, this is a famous story they'll have to tell. And then at some point, after he kept being like the district attorney, at some point, somebody just said, oh, for God's sakes, Jerry, it's about tradition. And he said, write that. So, and in that way, you see how a director does his job, asks the question that they're working on this show, they don't know what it's about. And this leads to one of the greatest opening numbers in musical theater. And, it says to the audience exactly what they're here to see.
Yeah, it sure does.
The Jewishness is the center of the story. And, so many producers feared, oh my God, it's too Jewish. But then it became this international success because of Jerome Robbins having identified the tradition and the breaking of a way of life as the overall, as the concept of the show.
Yeah.
But one of the musical theater historians says of how he went with his then fiancée to see a production in Chicago, and she came out as saying, "This is the first time ever I wished I were Jewish." So
thank you so much for being on The Times Will Tell. It's very good listening, I'm sure.
Thank you, Jessica.
And listeners, we'll be back obviously with a daily briefing tomorrow, and Times Will Tell every week on Friday. Take care. Be well.
Thanks so much for listening to Times Will Tell from the Times of Israel, and thanks to our producer, Gilad Brownstein.
Please subscribe wherever you find your podcasts and check out our daily briefing news show every Sunday through Thursday.
Like what you hear? Consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to spread the word.
Until next week.
Shalom.